Okay, I think we're online now. And at some characteristics of the New Testament church, last thing we looked at was the word E has to be considered. So we hold on to the truth and don't continue to move away from that and thus lose being the church. But there's some other doctrinal matters that need to be recognized as well as what we have discussed. Because if our doctrine is not right, then our practice is not going to be right either, is what it boils down to. One is, and I'm just going to lump several of them together under Calvinism. The Calvinistic doctrine is wrong. That we are born first, the total depravity aspect. Calvinism, of course, is a system of theology that's based upon what John Calvin taught. And there's basically 5 principles that he set forth. They are used under the acrostic TULIP. The first is total depravity of man. The second, unconditional election. The L would stand for limited atonement. I would stand for irresistible grace. And then P, the perseverance of the saints. And so those are your 5 basic doctrines of Calvinism. When we go to that first one, total depravity, sometimes it's referred to as total hereditary depravity, that babies are born in sin. When we think of that, though, in that way, a lot of times we limit the scope of what the Calvinistic teaching is, because the idea of total depravity goes beyond just an inherited sin. That is a teaching of total depravity, but they say we are not only born sinners, we then have an inability to do anything that is pleasing to God. In other words, you cannot obey God. It's an impossibility. You cannot do anything that would please Him. Hebrews 11 and verse 6, without faith it's impossible to please Him. Well, you can't have faith, according to this, because you're totally depraved. There is nothing good within you. And so it goes beyond simply an inherited sin. It begins with that, and there's many passages that would show the idea of inherited sin would be wrong. In fact, in a discussion just a few minutes ago on Facebook with someone, they asked me, when Adam and Eve had Cain, then they passed on that sin to him, and I told him no. Ask him the question that when Zacharias and Elizabeth had a child, since both of them were righteous before God, as it states, and blameless, did they pass on that righteousness to their child? He never did answer. And that's, of course, Luke 1 and verse 5 and 6 says about Zacharias and Elizabeth, and their child, of course, was John the Baptist.
Michael, you mean he just wouldn't answer at all, or?
He ignored the question totally.
Oh, so he saw his, okay.
He did not say anything about it, just totally ignored it. which later on I might come back and ask him again and insist that he answer it. But that one, of course, one that we oftentimes use would be in Ezekiel 18 and verse 4, that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And that again is stated in verse 20, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And then it states specifically, the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. So that shows this idea of an inherited sin is not right. An individual, when he is born innocent. One that I have not really dealt with in this discussion yet would be in Matthew the 18th chapter. And in verse 3, he's talking about, verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. The word little children there is a word which includes babies, a newborn baby. So when you substitute the two views, innocent or sinful, a baby is born innocent or a baby is born sinful, and you substitute it into that verse, and you're dealing with entering into the kingdom of heaven. Okay, except ye be converted and become as little children, or as little sinners, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, obviously, that's not true, and everybody recognizes the error of that. If you substitute, though, verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become innocent, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, that makes perfect sense. So it has to be one or the other. Being sinners does not fit. Being innocent does. A child is born innocent. But based then upon that total depravity, you have irresistible grace, because man cannot do anything that would please God. God has to take the initiative on man's behalf and do something for man so that man can then properly respond to him. And since God's grace is that which we're dealing with then, it would be an impossibility to resist that grace. This is where you get the predestination as well, that God has predestined certain individuals to eternal life and predestined some to eternal damnation. Well, with irresistible grace, God has already determined who he's going to save, and so he's going to come upon them and put his grace upon them so that they can now recognize their sin, they can respond in obedience to what God wants them to do, and thus God saves them. Thus, in, for example, Ephesians 2 and verse 8, for by grace are you saved, and that not of yourselves, or for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. They discuss the gift of God having reference to faith. God gives you faith so you can be saved. Well, the gift of God there is dealing with salvation, not with faith. It simply grammatically cannot apply to faith. Well, God's grace, the gift of God, is salvation. And the way in which we are saved is by grace through faith. But they believe that God gives unto man faith. He injects faith into the heart of man so that he can be saved. But again, it's God doing it, not what we do. Faith is not something that we have. Faith is something that God does to us. And this grace of God is irresistible. In other words, there's no way that I can resist God's grace. God's going to save me whether I want to be saved or not. And if I want to be saved and God hasn't determined to save me, then there's nothing, I'm just out of luck. There's nothing I can do to be saved.
Michael, do you think that most, well, this is a rhetorical question, but I'm sure most people who are in these various religious organizations, and most of which have the underpinnings of Calvinism built in, can actually articulate that, or they don't even know that that's what being a member of that religious organization is. They don't even know.
I think that's the case nowadays, that denominationalism has backed away from it so much, and it's more feel-good sermons and how to live a good life and enjoy it, be a good citizen and be a good neighbor and things like that, that the majority of people don't even know what their real teaching is all about. And in reality, they cannot do those things unless God does it for them. And they talk a lot about God's grace, but they could not articulate really what the basis of their doctrine even consist of. I'm saying that from the way in which I see it, at least. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's generally what we would find today in denominationalism. And as I say, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's probably true. Since God has only determined, though, to save certain individuals, and one of the difficulties and something that they do not like to discuss, if God only determined to save certain individuals, then by its very nature, God has determined to send certain individuals to hell without anything that they've done that's good or bad. They can do nothing about it. God's going to send them to hell no matter what. And they might even want to be saved. They might want to do what's right. Too bad they're going to hell because God determined it. Well, they don't like to discuss the aspect of punishment in relationship to God's decision. They just want to talk about God's grace in saving certain individuals. What about those individuals they didn't determine to save?
Well, how do they know that they're on the list?
Here's another thing. It's the old experience, that they had some type of a religious experience, some type of a feeling that they had in their heart, and as a result of that feeling, that they know that they have been saved. That's basically, I think if you really pin a lot of people down today that talk about the new birth, we have to be, what do you mean by that? And really what it boils down to is that they have a feeling in their heart that they are saved, and that feeling is that new birth according to them. Now then, and we should know that's not the new birth, but that is what they are defining as the new birth. That goes back to the old same thing as the mourner's bench religion, that for some experience that they can tell the congregation, that the congregation then can then vote upon whether or not that was a salvation experience. And so, whatever it might be, that's their experience that shows that they've been saved. And that's how they determine it.
But, Michael.
Very subjectively. Yes.
Do they not have amongst their membership, those who have had similar experience as them, but have in a sense left the faith? I'm sure they do, isn't it? Fallen, as you call, backslided membership.
Well, we'll get to that one point, but
what I meant,
yes,
since that they do have backslided membership, then the measure of standard by using that religious experience, as you call it, is not actually a safe mode of measuring their salvation, isn't it? Because if those members who have had those experiences, that's right. So in that case, then I think the conclusion is that they have no security for their salvation. They can't be sure, isn't it?
Well, sometimes they say they make that reference to they were not really of us.
Yeah, that's where they go to, that they were never saved to begin with. But then what you're saying is, then that experience that they had, experience, and thus the experience that they're dealing with, any type of experience to show salvation, is not a valid way of knowing whether or not one is saved. And that would be an accurate assessment of the situation. If they...
And the thing is also that they would...
What, Sonny?
No, I mean that, by the same token, basically, that also implies, you see, that they cannot be sure of their own salvation, because you can't tell the future. A once faithful member of their congregation could, if he or she has backslided, and they draw the conclusion that, well, after all, he has never been on the list. So then, how do you know that? As what Johnny said, how do you know that you are on the list? You can't be sure of that you're on the list until the end is near, until you come to the end. So there's no certainty. There's no
certainty at all with that doctrine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and that's accurate. Yeah. There is no assurance.
Yeah.
And yet they talk about they're the ones who have assurance. Well, no, they don't, because they're relying upon a experience that does not determine whether or not they were saved or not. They don't know. And if somebody else has the same religious experience they had, but that one falls away, it sure wouldn't give me any confidence in relationship to the aspect of salvation today.
That's why we don't have many debates anymore.
Well, that's true. Their doctrine has been so shown to be false. They learn don't debate, and most of them would not have the ability to anyway. But since God is going to only save a certain limited number, then it would be foolish for Christ to have died for those individuals that God had determined to send to hell. And so the next logical procession in this false doctrine is that Jesus only died for the limited few that God had determined to save. And all of the passages dealing with, for example, Christ died for all, they basically read that all of those that God has determined safe, but certainly not all men. That would be from Hebrews 2 and verse 9, or Titus 2 and verse 11. The grace of God hath appeared unto all men. Well, they read that as being all men that God has determined to save. So they eliminate all of those individuals that God has determined to send to hell.
So why do they have preachers that they support anyway, if they don't need to really do that?
Well, that is a great question, because in reality, those preachers are useless. If God has already determined to save somebody, then they don't need a preacher preaching to them. That individual is going to be saved no matter what that preacher does, no matter if anyone comes to him or not. It is a self-defeating proposition in reality. The irresistible grace, or unconditional election, is really where predestination comes in, and there is a biblical predestination, but theirs is a predestination of the individual, that God has determined to save those individuals. There's nothing that they can do to change that, to alter it in any way. That individual has been predestined by God before the world began to either salvation or damnation. Now, there's a couple of predestination. There's, and I'll use the term radical predestinationist, and they would be that everything within your life has been predestined by God. So there's Brian over there chewing on something. That was predestined before the world began, that you would be chewing at that time when I said that. And you didn't have any choice in the matter. You were going to be chewing on
Yeah.
That's the extreme aspect of predestination, that any movement, any action, any word has already been predestined by God. There's another aspect that's not as radical in their views on this, and that deals with the aspect of only our eternal salvation or damnation is predestined by God. And thus, the specific actions that we take were not predestined, but our eternality, our salvation or damnation is. So there's the two aspects of predestination. We teach that man is a free moral agent. He has the ability to choose. Predestination removes that ability. Joshua's statement that in relationship to choose you this day whom you will serve in Joshua 24:15 shows that. And Paul was at 19:10 as the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. Well, they wouldn't have any difficulty with that one, as to, yes, those individuals who would have been lost if it had not been for Christ being coming, and it's thus He is the one who saves them, but it's only those that God had already determined to save. That's the way in which He was going to save them. It's kind of a convoluted aspect in that, but that's the way in which they would respond to it. The choosing, and in Acts 2, where it says that He, with many other words, exhorted them to save themselves from this untoward generation. And just as a comment on that, in with many other words did He testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation, Acts 2 and verse 40. The tense of the word there is a passive, they would emphasize, and being a passive, it should not be save yourselves, it should be saved. Active selves, you're doing the action. Be saved is someone acting upon you. And so they would say that the correct way in which to translate that would be, with many other words did He testify and exhort, saying, be saved from this untoward generation. Well, first off, why would He exhort them to do anything if they can't do anything? That they cannot do anything. God has to do it for them, and so God is acting upon them, then why did he testify and exhort? There's no need for it. The second aspect of this would be that while it is a passive, it is also an imperative. Imperative is a command. For a command to be given, by its very nature, demands action on the person who has been commanded to do something. And so, in reality, this is a beautiful illustration. Yes, God is the one who saves us, but man has to respond in obedience for God to save us. And so it takes in both aspects, God's part and man's part. God's part is saving us. Man's part is his obedience. There's the imperative aspect of save yourselves from this untoward generation. And yet God is the one who saves them based upon their obedience. So it's a beautiful combination of both God's grace, man's faith. We're saved by grace through faith. And they tend to forget that. And so while they might want to stress it's be saved, maybe it is the case they saw, in reality at one time I went through every passive imperative in the New Testament. And all of them require action on the part of the one who has been commanded to do something, the imperative aspect of it. Now then, why would Acts 2:40 be any different? It's not. That's the whole point. By its very nature of being an imperative. They would say that it is an unconditional election, thus, that God, without anything on our part, has elected us to salvation or damnation. They would be wanting to talk about purely the salvation part, but in reality they would have to deal with the damnation as well. And then the last one, perseverance of the saints, we generally refer to it as once saved or once in grace, always in grace. They many times want us to salvation. What they don't want to deal with is man's ability to remove himself from God's protection. In Peter, the first chapter, it talks about here's the hope that we have of an inheritance that's incorruptible, undefiled, fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for us, who are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. And so while they would want to emphasize that, kept by the power of God, and so no one can be lost. Well, the problem is, in relationship to that, the figure that is being used is pretty much of a fortress that's there. The power of God is that fortress. No one can come into that fortress and destroy us. That which they don't want to deal with is the fact that we have the right to leave that fortress, and once we leave that fortress, we'll be destroyed. I really, when you get to once saved, always saved, or perseverance of the saints, I don't know how anyone can miss all of the warnings, the statements, specific statements about the possibility of apostasy, the possibility of falling away. If after Well, just go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and continue on through the end of the New Testament. Why was it written? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, while it sets forth the biography of Jesus, many of the statements that are found in those books deal with the possibility of apostasy. Acts, while it's written basically to show man how to be saved, book of conversions in that regard, and thus the spread of the gospel, yet also gives warning people being lost. Chapter 20, verse 28 or 29 through 32, which be a good illustration that even among yourselves shall men rise speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. Well, there's disciples who are drawn away, and they're going to be lost. If once saved, always saved was true, there would be no reason to write Revelation through or Romans through Revelation. The entire New Testament would be really worthless if once saved, always saved was correct. One individual, and I don't remember offhand who it was, it seems like it was Guyan Woods, Johnny might remember, that stated that 1 in every 25 verses in the New Testament says something either directly or indirectly dealing with the possibility of apostasy. How can we miss? And yet some do, sad to say. So these type of doctrinal matters have to be recognized. Let me mention the one that's starting to make inroads, and they like to boast, but it seems like they are making more inroads today, and that's the idea of realized eschatology. 80-70 doctrine, Max Kingism, and goes by some other names as well. Covenant eschatology is another one that's sometimes used. Basically, this says that last things have already taken place. Eschatology is a study of last things. Realized says that all of the last things that are prophesied within the Bible has already taken place. And they would center upon 80-70 as being the time in which all of those things took place. That everything, the second coming of Christ took place at 80-70. The resurrection took place in 80-70. The eternal state of man basically is 80-70. There's more and more people taking this. It literally destroys the hope that we have as Christians. And yet, when it first came out, was popularized really by Max King in his book, The Spirit of Prophecy, that was published in 1971. And I didn't hear about it until later on, but I thought, what a totally ludicrous doctrine. I mean, it was, and to me, it's still a stupid, ludicrous doctrine. One of the questions that I asked them invariably will be relating to Matthew 22, where Jesus says, "You're neither in the resurrection, they're neither married nor given in marriage, but are as the angels in heaven." If the resurrection has already taken place, then why are they married? And most of them are. According to their view, to be consistent, they need to get out of their marriages. Now, in a discussion that has been taking place lately in a Facebook group, someone asked about that aspect along with some others, and he was told that in that today there's neither male nor female, using passage in Galatians 3:28. And so the question was, then do you support women preachers and elders? Do you support? Well, if there's neither male nor female, then couple getting married, they're neither male nor female, homosexual marriages would have to be acceptable. But as I say, it's just a ludicrous doctrine. Another question that I like to ask them, since the resurrection has already taken place, are you in heaven or in hell right now? And which one am I in? And then what's the difference between the two? And you can go on with questions likened to that. But 80-70, while, and another term that's used, Lang mentioned this, is preterism. Preterism basically is everything that took place was near. There's different forms of preterism, though. When we're dealing with the 80-70 doctrine and realized eschatology, they are radical preterists. That is, everything within the Bible took place immediately within that time frame. There's others who are preterist in some ways. For example, the book of Revelation. I'm pretty much, as far as the book of Revelation, a preterist. Now, I'm not a radical preterist in the sense that there's still the second coming of Christ in the future. There's still the judgment, which they say took place. There's the resurrection of the body. And 1 Corinthians 15 is a good passage that they have difficulty with. They want to talk about the resurrection being there, the resurrection of cause. Well, the problem is it's a resurrection of the body. It's a bodily resurrection, which they basically have rejected. But if there's not a bodily resurrection, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ's not raised, then we're all men most miserable. But 1 Corinthians 15 does give them a great deal of problem, along with a lot of other passages. But that's full preterism, simply because someone sees in certain passages that it's dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. Or, for example, in Revelation, I believe it's primarily dealing with the destruction of Rome. I would take a later date, mid-90 date. There's some who take an early date. For example, Foy Wallace was one who advocated an early date prior to AD 70, and he said that all of it referred to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Well, is it a prior to AD 70, or is it at AD 70?
As to, he said that the book was written at prior to AD 70, Revelation.
Because it doesn't include anything about the destruction of Jerusalem.
No, it all dealt with the destruction of Jerusalem, according to Foy Wallace. Everything in Revelation, destruction of Jerusalem, it was not dealing with the end of the world and such. But he did believe that other passages dealt with the end of the world, which they say took place at AD 70, full preterist or radical preterist. Those who teach and realize eschatology, the end of the world took place in AD 70. You didn't know that, but the world ended then.
This is just Michael, an altered reality, yeah. Okay.
Michael.
Yes.
My understanding is that the argument was it wasn't the end of the world they were talking about, it was the end of the age. It was an age issue, not the world.
But they also, they would say, yes, end of the age, but it's also the end of the world, because you had the second coming, you had judgment. Everything took place in AD 70.
Yeah, that's true. I heard of an argument that suggested that Jesus in Matthew 24 was referring to the end of the age. He was not talking about the world. So AD 70 deals with that age itself, not the world. I mean, I know it's very complicated. I don't involved in it, but that was what I understand. Is there was someone who holds that view. See?
In Matthew 24. Up until, and I'll just say it real quickly, up until verse 36, you're dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. And it does refer to it as a coming of Christ. And in a limited sense, it is a coming of Christ. In Revelation, the 2nd chapter, you have Christ saying to the church at Ephesus that if you don't repent, I will come, well, there's the coming of Christ, and take away your candlestick. And so there's a limited coming of Christ in relationship to that as well. Any coming of Christ in judgment, and there might be other times during history in which you have comings of Christ, that is, that he is coming in judgment upon a people or a nation.
Well, you'd have to, with that, you would always have to have the period of all the various captivities.
Well, in that way, yes, you have, and there you find in the Old Testament the day of the Lord to a great extent. But there you have, in all of these, you have a coming of Christ. You have him coming in a limited sense. There is, though, in the future, an unlimited sense in which Christ is going to come, and this world will be destroyed, which they have to redefine everything basically in 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, in order to hold their view. Because when Christ comes, this world will be destroyed. It will melt. The elements will melt with fervent heat. They have to redefine all of that in order to try and hold to the fact that he came in AD 70. Well, if he came in AD 70 and the elements were destroyed and melted with fervent heat, then what do we have today? As I said, it is, but I do want to get back to this idea. There's the full preterist, who hold the aspect that everything ended, and everything as far as prophecy ended in AD 70. There's other preterists who hold that certain statements of the Bible, and for example Revelation, I think, deals primarily with the aspect of the destruction of Rome, and that Christ, yes, was going to come in judgment upon Rome, and thus you have a coming of Christ in relationship to that. But there are certain elements that are still in the future dealing with, and we call it the second coming. Maybe we should change our terminology to the final coming of Christ. That just a state terminology. We mean the same thing by it, so it doesn't bother me to use second coming. You have the end of the world. This world and all of the elements and everything that is part of it will be destroyed, burned up, melt with fervent heat, and then we go into eternity.
Michael, has there been it generally in that area in Revelation seems to fall sort of sectarian, either before AD 70 or around that area, and then in the 90s. But isn't there the possibility that we're looking at, just as with prophecies of Isaiah, looking at something that more multi-level that could include both Jerusalem and Rome?
I think in some cases there are certainly overtones, or you have a limited fulfillment and a full fulfillment. and maybe limited fulfillment isn't the right terminology to use, but it is a limited aspect of what he's talking about with the aspect of a future true fulfillment that he's dealing with. There's a lot of passages that might fall under that category. A lot of things in Revelation seem to have a dual meaning. For example, if you look in Revelation, what is it? The latter part of chapter 6, that here's kings of the earth, great men, rich men, and that go into the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? While I think, and my view of that would be that it's dealing with the destruction of Rome, can the application of an eternal nature of it? I think yes, there probably could, even though the main aspect that he's dealing with is the destruction of Rome. And others would view that it's dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. Others would say that that's dealing with the end of the world and the second coming. So there's certainly room for different applications as to what things are applied to in Revelation, and some of them, yes, might have a dual application.
Well, I just noticed that it's often sort of hard-lined in one or the other, and I mean, even with all of the various books, Homer Hale, all of those books, I've sort of personally thought that there was an earlier writing, but it multi-leveled into Jerusalem, Rome, and then, of course, the last day. But
and again, in going back to the realized eschatology view, they have to have it dealing with and totally everything in that being fulfilled in 87. And that nothing would refer to anything else other than 8070. But that's what I'm trying to express. There are preterists that are not full preterist or radical preterist who, yes, believe that things in, for example, Revelation are dealing primarily with that day and time. That's not a problem. Because they still look for that second coming of Christ, the judgment, the end of the world, and going off into, after the judgment, heaven or hell. Full preterists really, in effect, take away our hope. Some of them, the full preterists, start that way and end up going into universalism, that everyone is going to be saved. But going back to, and we'll kind of end with this, the idea is doctrine does make a difference. We have to have the right doctrine. If we don't have the right doctrine, then we're not going to be right with God. If we don't have the right doctrine, and if we're not teaching the right doctrine, then we're not going to be the church that Christ established. And so, yes, doctrinal matters must be recognized, and we must be accurate with them. Otherwise, anything goes in reality. So with that, let's kind of end at that point in time, or with that, and not next week, but the week after, because next week's our lectureship, But the week after that, we'll pick up with another aspect of identifying the church. So let me go ahead and stop the broadcast and